Good morning. Glad to be together again today. And I was thinking about some of my friends. I've got a prayer list long around the world, people scattered around, and got a letter here from Perth. That's far, far western Australia, from missionary Rick Watkins. I'll read a little bit of that to you in a minute. But just thinking about our holidays, and you that are near family and friends, I want to encourage you, take some extra time to pray for those who are scattered, separated from family. There's several groups of people that need a little extra, I don't know, a little love and attention maybe. There is that group that are those people that are maybe alone, widowed, homeless. Those people need some of our love and attention. And then, of course, there's those people who are like missionaries that are far, or our military, those that are far from home geographically. And I got a picture just the other day from one of our young men who is he was in the Army, and he's sent a picture of their Thanksgiving table with they had their turkey dinner, and the Army young people all lined up. It was boot camp, and but there are people away from loved ones, family, and it makes holidays a little more difficult. And of course, there's people in our rest homes. And if God puts somebody in your heart, call them, send them a text, send them a letter, go to the store, buy a card, send them a card. Everybody's different, what is appropriate or what helps. But take some time to think about those people that are far away. There's so many needs. What a great thing to have the holiday time of year, and I love that I've got family, and in recent days able to have all of my children around, and not going to happen a whole lot in the days ahead, if depending on how God plans things, but it's very possible we'll have kids in another country in the mission field. Our son Josiah is planning on going to Trinidad. Just raising support, just has a few churches he's met with now. And then our daughter and her husband, our daughter Hannah, they're working at a church in Indiana. And then there's, a couple of kids that God, by his mercy, chose to have stay close by, but there's no guarantee of that. But during the holidays, think about those people who don't have that. And let's on purpose be good to people. If you may not be able to visit in a convalescent home, but you can call, and you can send a picture, you can send a note or whatever. But let's be good to people. Let's think during the holidays of people who are forgotten or alone. When you're alone, the hours drag. And that goes for the people in jail as well as the people in the convalescent home. Whatever put them there is not the issue. The issue is they're alone, and they could sure use some kindness. I want to read you a little bit of a letter from Rick Watkins, a friend of mine who is in Perth. That's Sydney would be far east Australia. Perth is way across, and I don't know how big Australia is, but it's huge. And of course, the middle section of Australia is all wilderness. The Aborigines, much of it is their native land, and no one goes in there. But I wanted to read just a word or two about the Rick Watkins from his letter. He mentions several people getting saved, and he's having many Iranian converts, and that's kind of exciting. And then they come to they have temporary student visas or whatever. They get into Australia, and then they get saved. Well, now they can't go back because there's a big problem if they go back. And now they're trying to get refugee status. And it's you that are in America, would you just thank God? I know we're in a mess, but let's thank God for how good he is and how many good things he's done for us. And now, Australia, understand this before I read it. Australia is today what many of our socialist liberal politicians would like to have: a very strong centralized government ordering and controlling the affairs of the people. And of course, it just wasn't many years ago, Australia had this great idea to curb crime, and they had a buyback program, and they destroyed millions of dollars worth of firearms, and basically got rid of most of the firearms in neighborhoods. And then they passed laws where if you have a gun, you have to be a member of a gun club of some kind to justify having it. And then you have to have the gun locked up in one safe in your house, and you have to have the ammunition locked up in another safe in your house. Well, what good is home defense with a gun and the ammunition in two different safes. You know, the guy's breaking in your window, and you say, "Could you hang on just a minute till I find the combination of these two safes?" And just crazy. But what's going on in Australia today follows the taking away of all the firearms. And so over in far, far Western Australia, um, this is from Brother Watkins, and I'm just trusting his call. He says, because of the closed borders, we have had no cases of COVID, period. They've had no COVID in their whole area. He said the only people sick are those having reactions to the vaccines. He said one of their ladies, Sadaf, an Iranian convert, she had her second Pfizer jab in September, was extremely sick for over a week. Since then, she's been diagnosed with Graves' disease and hyperthyroidism. And the doctors told her that the Pfizer jabs did not play a part in her current illness, but she was in great health until the day of her second jab. Another, Jeffrey, is their church treasurer, 50 years old, and is now having heart issues and has a large cyst that started as a welt under his right arm. All this started after his second Pfizer jab. Doctors are trying treatments before they have to do surgery. We pray they don't have to do that. Then he goes through talking about converts here and converts there, and what a wonderful job he's doing. And again, it's interesting, most of his converts over the years, over recent years, I'm going to say the last 10 years, have been immigrants into Australia. The Australian people, the Aussies, are pretty self-sufficient. The government takes care. There's no homelessness there, supposedly. I've been there. I've preached there on many occasions. And the government takes care of people. There's not a homelessness issue. There's a huge tax issue. But there's a lot of government hands in things. And now, if people aren't getting vaccinated, now this is not from Rick Watkins, this is from the news. So we know the news is twisted and warped a little bit, both sides, the conservative and the liberal. but now the news talks about them going door to door. And if you've not been vaccinated, or if you're a friend of someone who has COVID or whatever, these different combinations, they're taking people, I don't know how many or what cities they're taking people to basically, let's go to camp for a couple of weeks. And they're trying to isolate people. And, you can't go door to door grabbing people and making them go somewhere when they're still armed. And don't think our government is beyond concentration camps in one term or another. And that though they be Australian, they're speaking Nazi language politically. And be very, very guarded here in America. You better cling tightly to your freedom and your Constitution. And but in regards to the medical world, not one case of COVID there, and yet such pressure. And then over in New Zealand, I've got friends there, and they tell similar stories that it's a totally isolated island country, and such government pressure, and yet no, places with almost no COVID or no COVID, and yet all this pressure. And I just want to encourage you, prayerfully do what you do. Whatever you do is up to you. And in our church, we've got a lot of people who've chosen to take one vaccine. I don't know which one. We don't talk about it. We believe in freedom. You do what you want. But some have chosen to take a vaccine. Some didn't, haven't. And I think it's completely up to them. It's none of my business what you do in your medical world. But I hope we all will do a little investigative research before we just surrender. We don't know what's going on. And I've mentioned this before, but the child mortality, the minor, 18 years and under, dying from COVID, it is almost non-existent. It's so low. Even 40 and under is pretty, you see the graphs of deaths, and yet for some reason the government is pushing to vaccinate our children, young children, and making them wear masks. And a while back, I heard a little girl at a school board meeting saying, you don't wear masks to go to the store. You don't wear masks to go out in public. You don't wear masks when you're at work, but you're making me wear a mask for 6 hours or how many hours a day in my school. And she was a little third grader, a little kid, second grader, whatever. And she was irritated. She said, I hope you go to jail where you belong. we've never had something so divisive, even husbands and wives differing on things. And I'm grateful my wife and I see eye to eye on this. But I want you to understand, you've got a God who takes care of things. And we're not going to make every decision right politically. We're not going to make every decision right as a nation in regards to immigration or finance or business. And we're just not. You know what? Christians have been serving God ever since the time of Christ. People have been busy for God. And what we need to pray is that God would do great things in our situation. Where I think we are too often praying God would deliver us from the situation, and God would like to bless us in that situation. And I'm not saying if my knee bothers you, I'm not saying I've never prayed my knee get better, although I can't remember, but I'm thinking I have. But I think, you know what, if I'm 64, if I'm going to have a bad knee, what, isn't it a blessing? The only part of me that hurts is one knee. That's pretty incredible. That's a good 64 years. I hope it's 64 years before another part of me hurts. But let's be blessed where we are. Let's find God's hand on us where we are. I want you to look with me back over at the book of Genesis chapter 12. And the story is of Abraham. And the pages of my Bible are all worn out and tore up here. But in Abraham, now God has taken Abraham and moved him from his home, which would be over at U-R, over where the Euphrates River is, Iraq, Iran, that area, way over the other side of Saudi Arabia. And he said, I want you to go to a land I'll show you. So he leads Abraham and his family all the way over to the land of Canaan to give him that land. And verse 7, in Genesis 12, and verse 7, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared to him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east side of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. Now you can follow through this, and the promise, you've heard me talk about, imagine, but there's an Abrahamic covenant. That is a promise God made to Abraham that his seed, his children would possess the land, the literal physical land from the Mediterranean east. That'd be their land. The Abrahamic covenant is about land, and it's a promise that God's never going to break. Later on, you see the promise, the covenant, or the covenant with David, that there would be a son of David on the throne of Israel, and that, of course, eventually would be Jesus when he comes back. But here we look at Abraham, and he builds an altar. He seeks after God, but he is in a land of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites. He's not in a church place. This is his own people. And he and his family and people that work with him, the herdsmen and all, he had a bunch of soldiers with him. He had his own private army that he brought up in his household. And see, they're in a foreign land. And yet in that foreign land, he sought God and he served God, and everybody knew who Abraham was. He became a mighty man. You look on a little bit further, if you would, over to the book of Nehemiah, and the King Samuel, Kings and Chronicles tells the story of the nation of Israel before they go into captivity. Then they go into captivity for 70 years, and Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. He was over in Babylon, and in Babylon in captivity. So his nation had crumbled, his city destroyed, a good portion of the people killed, and then the poorest of the poor were left there, scattered across the land, and then some of the affluent and the trained and the educated, they were carried away to Babylon, and many of them serving the king, as the king had a goal of controlling these nations, but he needed somebody who knew the cultures, and if he was going to deal with somebody in Egypt, he wanted an Egyptian helping him. If you're going to deal with people in Israel, he wanted a Hebrew helping him. So now we're in a foreign land, and the story of Nehemiah, the beginning is in Babylon, and he is the king's cupbearer. Let me read just a couple verses in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. He heard about the walls of the city broken down, and just the mess the country's in, because the prior book, Ezra, they had begun rebuilding the temple. but he's checking up on things. It's not good news. And in verse 4, Nehemiah of chapter 1, and it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech thee, O God of heaven, the great and terrible God, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. Let thine ear be attentive and thine eye open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now, day and night, for the children of Israel, thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned. He's been in Babylon for 70 years. He didn't cause the fall of Jerusalem, but as a people, he's confessing the sins of his nation, like you and I should, the sins of America. And both I and my father's house, we have dealt very corruptly, I'm in verse 7, against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments, which thou commandest thy servant. And so here he is seeking God's help. Now you go down to the end of chapter 1 in verse 11. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, to the prayer of thy servants who desire to fear thy name. Prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he's about to go to the king and seek permission to go to Babylon, to Israel, and help with the rebuilding of the walls around the city. It had already been proclaimed that it was okay to do it. And back in the prior book, Zerubbabel, in the book of Ezra, Zerubbabel and others had gone to rebuild, but the place was still a shambles, unprotected. And so Nehemiah wants to go, and he's going to go to his boss and basically ask for some time off. And so in chapter 2, verse 2, wherefore the king said to me, why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was sore afraid. He'd never been sad. No one had a right to be sad around the king. You're supposed to be encouraging to the king. What a concept, that you control your heart and your feelings so that you're a blessing to others and you don't dump your feelings all over. We are in such a ridiculous world where we want everybody to feel our pain. And it is so, anyway, it's just not old-fashioned America. Bear ye one another's burdens, Paul wrote. And then he said, and every man shall bear his own burdens. It's my job to carry my burden, and then it's my job to carry your burden. And that's biblical Christianity, not this world of I dump my burdens and spew them out all over the world and make everybody in the world miserable because I've had a problem. That's not Bible Christianity. But the point is, he's in verse 11, he's the king's cupbearer. Now, where is he? He's in Babylon. He's in a foreign country, different language, different culture, different music, different food, different everything. But he was a victorious person. He was close to God and sought God. So we find Abraham, the founder of the Hebrew people, and he's in a foreign land. We find Nehemiah over there. Of course, Nehemiah's world was the same world as Daniel. And Daniel, again, as a young person, all the way across, taken prisoner to Babylon. What did Daniel do? He sought the Lord. He stood for God. He purposed in his heart he wouldn't defile himself with the garbage of the world around him. Daniel just made a decision. I'm going to live for God. See, those kind of things, we're dangerously near to thinking if my world around me isn't just right, I can't be a good Christian. No, you be a good Christian because you're a good Christian. You love God because you love God. You read his book because you read his book. And if the world spits on you, kicks you, if you're born with a handicap, if you're lost your spouse, maybe you've had some difficulties, lost a business or whatever it might be, we still ought to seek God, and we still ought to seek God's power and God's blessing and do right. You want to go through another great leader. You find the book of Jeremiah, and I'll just read a verse or two here because I don't want to go too long. But in Jeremiah, now this is prior to Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah is after the captivity. Jeremiah is before the captivity, so I didn't do these in order. But Jeremiah is a young man, maybe a boy, and the warning message of Jeremiah and Isaiah was, you better repent or God's going to literally send them to Babylon in captivity. And Jerusalem would be destroyed, which it was. They did not listen to the preaching of Jeremiah. They thought they knew better, and they threw him in prison, all kinds of things. But Jeremiah was called from his childhood, from his womb, from his mother's womb. He was called to be a preacher. And so he's in the land of Israel. So Abraham was in the land of Canaan as a stranger. Nehemiah was in the land of Babylon, in exile from Israel. Nehemiah is in Israel, but he's in Israel in a time of terrible backslidden and carnal living. It was a horrible, godless place. And you find Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I'm a child. I'm just a young, whatever a child was. He said, I'm too young to do this. And what did God say in verse 8? Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee. I have put my words in thy mouth. And so here Jeremiah, and you read the book of Jeremiah, wow, he was beaten and thrown in prison, and he was dumped into basically a sewer in the bottom of the palace, and he was carried away as a captive by his own Jewish people down to Egypt as they fled from Israel and against the will of God. And so we've got somebody in Canaan before it was Canaan, and he was a stranger in a strange land, but he served God. Then we got Nehemiah, I don't know, 1,000 miles, 800 miles away over in Babylon, and he lived for God like Daniel did, like Esther, like Naaman's handmaid. She was up north further in Assyria. And these guys, their circumstances didn't control their love for God in their heart. And then you got Jeremiah. He's in a terrible place and abused by his own people, to the point where God said, don't be afraid of their faces. You just go preach. I'll put my word in your mouth. You go preach to them. And Jeremiah was in trouble. At one point, he dictated some of the Bible to his associate pastor, and he read it before the king. The king took his knife out and cut it up and threw it in the fire. And then he sent people out to find Jeremiah and kill him. Jeremiah, he is in a terrible spot in his own home, in his own homeland. And yet in every one of these cases, what you find is you find a person who said, I'm going to live for God. I'm just going to live for God. And your circumstances are not the thing that's important. It's your love for God. And so you may be poor, you may have some money, you may be out of work, you may be found bankruptcy, maybe you're a widow, you're a widower, you're lonesome, you've got some burdens and heartaches. And I think most of our friends have got some burdens and heartaches. And understand this, we can seek God where we are today. We can seek God. Joseph and Mary, far from home, down in Nazareth, a long couple of day journey, by foot, very likely, all the way down, maybe 80 miles or further down to Jerusalem, near Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and a baby born. They lived there for a couple of years, and they didn't have, that we know of. There's nothing to indicate they had family or friends down there. And then they had to flee to Egypt, several hundred miles south, and down into Egypt, and they stay there for a while, and they come back, and they end up in Nazareth, up by the northern part by the Sea of Galilee. And you know what they did? They just kept trusting God. And life was not easy, and there were difficulties, but they said, you know what? We're going to live for God. And God chose these parents to raise his son. And every child's precious to God, and we ought to raise them for God. But think about these two; they're raising God's son, God, and that's stuff you can't quite figure out in your head. You think about it long enough, you'll not understand it. But here we sit. Understand this: we're in America, or maybe somebody's in Kenya or Nigeria, somebody's over in South America or wherever. Live for God. Live for God where you're. I've got friends in Australia and New Zealand, down in Tasmania, godly people, love God. Just seek God. Seek God where you are. Walk with him where you are. Maybe it's a plush family gathering with lots of beautiful things around the holiday season, or maybe you're very much alone during the holidays. Seek God. Seek God. Because that can be done in any culture. It can be done by John Bunyan in Bedford jail, where he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Seek God. And let's remember that is the main thing. And on my world around me may be awkward, but I'm not going to wait till my world gets good to seek God. I'll seek God right now when my world's not good. And if God chooses to give me a good governor, a good president, wonderful. If he chooses to leave corruption in the Capitol buildings, I'm going to seek God, and I want to honor him and love him. And I hope you will. Hey, let's be good to people these days. on purpose. Be good to the people at the checkout line and the people that work in the stores, and be good to the mechanic that works in your car, or the person, the telemarketer. Don't be rude to people. Let's be good to them, love them, encourage them. And we've got our, if you're attending our church, we've got this Jesus is the Reason season for the season gospel track here with the way of salvation in the back and information about our church. Get some of these when you're at church and pass them out in the grocery store, in the department store. Give them out to people you meet on the street. Let's pass out tracts. We have people saved every week. What a blessing. God has been so good, and how thankful we ought to be. But it's the work of the ministry. And so let's get on the team and work, and hope you have a great day. Thanks so much for joining me.